economic projection rise by 4.3%. It looks like Nigerians are about to see a repeat of 2025 as accounting firm PricewaterhouseCoopers projects that 141 million Nigerians could be living in poverty by December 2026. That's 62% of Nigeria's population. Now, this means yet again, Nigerians could see GDP rising without their pockets feeling the rise. Growth may not translate into meaningful income gains for most citizens.
PwC's Nigeria Economic Outlook 2026 highlights that recent economic policy adjustments have yet to deliver tangible benefits for households. Weak real income growth and persistently high living cost means that millions of Nigerians may see their economic situation worsen, even as headline inflation is expected to moderate. The report notes that lower income households remain particularly vulnerable to shocks with limited capacity to absorb rising prices. Join us this morning for this very important discussion is economist and co-founder of Truva Intelligence, Basil Abia. A warm welcome to you, Basil. Happy New Year. And it's great to have you join us this morning on Breakfast Central.
Yeah, Happy New Year. Thank you, guys.
Yes. I mean, I'm sure the government handlers, after putting out the last quarter GDP figures, will not be happy to see this report by PricewaterhouseCoopers, but I mean, they say the truth is bitter. It's what it is. That 141 million Nigerians were going to fall into poverty in 2026 is a cause for concern. So what factors do you think will be responsible for driving this projected rise in poverty despite economic growth forecast? Isn't there a contradiction here?
So the contradiction has to be cognizant of the fundamentals, right? What are the core fundamentals that are responsible for the fact that there's a high chance we're going to have close to an additional 20 million added to the 133 million multidimensionally poor Nigerians, according to the National Bureau of Statistics. And a lot of things that a lot of Nigerians really don't understand is that even though inflation data seems to be reducing. In fact, to be more accurate, Nigeria is currently going through a deflationary period, which means that the speed of the increase of aggregate prices in the economy has reduced. Now, that does not mean that prices have gone down significantly. You know, what that means basically is if we go back to the actual textbook definition of inflation, the subsequent recurring rise of prices across board in an economy is reducing at that speed, you know, per the price level period that the inflation data started being recorded. Now, as a lot of Nigerians do not really understand, there was a rebasing of how we calculate inflation. It happened very early in January 2025. Basically, what happened was three things. The first thing was that the price level that we were using to calculate inflation changed from 2009 to 2023. So the last level where we were using the price baskets for the entirety of aggregate prices had to change. So that also meant that the weighting that we were apportioning to certain things like housing, like gas, like electricity bills, you know, just a number of them, you know, food, for instance. Let me even give you more specifics or give the audience more specifics. As of 2009, the National Bureau of Statistics were calculating that an average consumption basket for an average Nigerian household was 50%, 50.9%, so basically 51% if you put it together. So 51% of the aggregate consumption for the average household in Nigeria as of 2009 went to food, right? And that was what we're using as our methodology for calculating the speed of the increase of aggregate prices. Now, according to the MBS, when they did their rebasing, they decided to use December 2023 as the last timeline for calculating inflation. And it meant that they would have to review the consumption basket for the average household. And according to them, the consumption basket for the average household switched from that 51% to 40%. So that meant that even if food inflation was still rising, the weightage for calculating inflation will reduce because you had reduced, the baseline with which you were using to calculate from 51% to 40%. Now, there were a number of reductions too. Outside of that, there were reductions for housing. There were also increases. For instance, healthcare costs increased from 3% to 6%. There were many other things but nothing can be as significant as that of the food inflation reduction, because the food basket for calculation reduced from 51% to 40%. Now, apologies for the technicalities, but I want to be able to make people understand why, even though on paper the macroeconomic fundamentals look seemingly on the up, but we're still going to have as many Nigerians as possible slide into slide into poverty. And the major reason for that is that while there is a deflation or a reduction in the increase of aggregate prices, what is actually happening is that, firstly, Nigerians on aggregate have not increased their earnings. So let me give you a typical example that I think everybody who is listening or watching this would understand and will be able to relate to. As of 2023 in July, or let's say May, let's use May for instance. May 1st, 2023, PMS price across board in Nigeria was between 190 naira to 200 naira per litre. As we're speaking right now, PMS price is between 750 naira to 850 naira. In fact, there are projections that might increase to 950 on average for 2026. That projection is actually from the CBN macroeconomic report outlook. Now, this basically means that your basket of consumption or your basket of expenditure between May 2023 till now definitely has increased, because you look at the price transmission of PMS price to almost everything. Almost everything increases. Your barber increases the amount he's charging you for cutting your hair, right? Your transportation increases, whether you're driving yourself or you have a driver or you're using Uber or Bolt or InDrive. All of that, the price transmission is the swiftest in our macroeconomic system. So basically what I'm trying to say here is that when that increase happened between 190 naira per litre to 750 naira, how many Nigerians on average increased their earnings relative to this particular increase that is very swift and very brutal on the average Nigerian pocket? Very few. Yes, we know that a number of companies increased their salaries for staff. A number of federal government offices also did that. The federal government also increased the average minimum wage. State governments, a number of them increased, even though we know that a number have still stuck with those numbers. But when you are concurrently looking at those numbers, there has not been a relative increase on average for Nigerians. So at the end of the day, the reason why that slide into poverty is going to happen is because on aggregate, earnings have not increased. Nigerians are not richer than they were 3 years ago.
Sorry to butt in, Basil. When Mr. President says the economy has turned the corner, what corner has he turned? And doesn't that translate to a better life for ordinary Nigerians? Or is talking about other fundamentals?
So, again, I'm not trying to, the wording is definitely wrong when he says the economy has turned the corner. I think what he should be saying is that the economy has stabilized, based on the core fundamentals. And this is relative to what the state of the economy was before. Relative to what the state of the economy was before, inflation was almost war-like, if not wartime, in terms of numbers, right? The spate of increases of almost everything was ridiculous, for the average consumer. 1. 2, foreign exchange was very hard to get by. It was so distorted that you had the black market rate, at a significantly higher rate than the mainstream market, or the official market. That obviously was one of the contributing factors to how and why our inflation was super high. Then you also had the monetization, of our fiscal space, largely by CBN printing money, to supplement a lot of the distortions that were happening in terms of our public expenditure. Outside of all of that, that contributed to why inflation was at an untenable rate. So what he should be saying, or what he should have said, on a technical basis, was that there is now some stabilization, but definitely the economy has not turned the corner, because what you're seeing again is that consumption has been hurt. And one of the easiest ways to look at that is to go and look at FMCGs in terms of what their sales are. Mm-hmm. Yes, their earnings have increased, and their earnings have increased again, like I mentioned, because of a number of factors. They have increased their prices to match, what the economy is currently going through. And that's why their earnings look quite good. Outside of that as well, there was the FX windfall gains of 2025 that almost every company enjoyed. That's not going to be the factor in 2026, because all of those windfall gains have now moved past, a number of things. So the simplest explanation to this is that the economy hasn't really turned the corner. What we are seeing is stabilization of the core fundamentals. And what are the core fundamentals macroeconomically? Your inflation rate, your interest rate, GDP numbers, as well as the earnings, especially the foreign exchange earnings. Foreign exchange earnings have stabilized. One, that obviously is the reason why the economy is stabilizing. Inflation rate, the rate of inflation has reduced. So we are now going through a deflationary period. It is easier to get access to foreign exchange now compared to 2023. So all of this obviously is stabilization. So that yields to the stabilization fact. But to turn the corner means a lot of things. To turn the corner means that we're at a 7 to 8% GDP growth rate. All right. To turn the corner means that we're at a single-digit inflation rate, but we are not a single-digit inflation rate up till now. To turn the corner means consumption rebounds significantly, which means people are spending money at ridiculous rates because they have higher earnings in their pockets.
Okay, Mr. Basil, just hold on. We'll go on a break. When we come back, I want to know how sustainable the economy is now that we know that if 62% of the population remains in poverty, how sustainable is that, the economy, and not forgetting to what Nigerians should actually know while they watch us this morning. Stay with us. We'll be right back. Welcome back. We're looking at the current state of Nigeria's economy with the recently published PwC 2026 Economic Outlook. And our guest has been breaking it down for us. But just in case it sounds too cumbersome or very, very tough for you to grab, we'll try and see if our next set of questions will be able to make it a bit lighter. And I'm sure our guest is ready to do so for you, our viewers, as well. Now we know that the economy, 62% of the population remains in poverty line, even though some quarters of the presidency do not agree with that. But the PwC report makes it clear. The question to you this morning is, for every single person watching from home, what does that mean for them in the coming months? And what does it mean for Nigeria's economy in the coming months as well?
So I'd answer it in two simple ways. First, for the average Nigerian, this basically means that if their earnings do not increase relative to the increase of prices over the last 2-3 years, they're going to slide into poverty numbers. And what are the acceptable poverty numbers right now? Is if you're spending less than $2 per day, or let's even go more traditional, if you're spending less than $1 per day. And what is the cost of $1 right now, generally in the market, both in the mainstream market and in the parallel market? That is about 1,417 naira or 1,418 naira. So on average, 1,500 naira a day. So it means that a lot of households who are not spending more than 1,500 naira a day, who do not even afford it, cannot afford it, are basically going to be, tagged as poor. That basically is what it is, and a number of reasons are responsible for that. The cost of energy prices, the cost of transportation, the cost of healthcare, the cost of food, regardless of the deflationary experience that we're now seeing with food prices, it's still not going to be sufficient enough to sustain these households. So these households are going to slide into more multidimensional poverty. And again, like I mentioned earlier, it's just because we're not, as a people, we're not earning enough on aggregate, and that's just not good enough for the economy. Now, what does this mean for the economy in general? Consumption, as you know, consumption is a huge backbone for the economy. Consumption relative to inflation reduction basically reduces, and that's not good for our mainstream economy. The real sector, that is those in manufacturing, those in services, are going to struggle to be able to maintain their current balance sheet numbers or their balance sheet expectations, because aggregate consumption on average is going to reduce. So the more people on aggregate slide into poverty, the less we see consumption numbers increasing. So that reduction in consumption affects every other part of the economy. Banks are not going to service as many companies as possible. They're not going to service as many deals that they would love to service. Cash flows that they're going to manage on behalf of companies would reduce in that sense. So right now, what are the solutions? What are the immediate things that government can do to ameliorate the situation and to trigger higher consumption and ensure that we halt a lot of the slide into poverty? Many things are important, but I think for me, the core fundamental for government that is constitutionally, imperative for them is first and foremost ensure that there is stability and security. There has to be stability and security for the markets to respond. There has to be security so that consumption can increase. Just look at northern Nigeria, for instance, especially north central and northeast Nigeria, and even with the recent attacks in Oyo State in southwest Nigeria, a lot of people are leaving the hinterlands and going to urban areas. That is increasing the high spate of urban poverty. So urban poverty is actually on the rise compared to other forms of poverty in the country, because a lot of people from rural areas are going to the semi-urban and urban areas because it's no longer tenable for them to live in these rural areas. Now, there's a lot of dynamic that we need to look at. How do we even produce in Nigeria? How do we produce food, for instance, in Nigeria? 95% of food production in Nigeria is carried out by rural smallholder farmers. So farmers that dwell in rural areas are the backbone of our food production. And if they are now leaving the rural areas to stay in semi-urban and urban areas where land rent systems for farming is even harder than normal, then it basically means that food production or food cultivation on aggregate is going to reduce. That contributes to a major reason why we're going to probably have that 160 or 140 million Nigerians fall into poverty, because a huge part of these people are food producers who are already low earning. Where am I getting my data from? The United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization has that data for the number of people that contribute to agricultural production in Nigeria. IFAD, for instance, as well, also have the data saying that out of this, 90% of these rural smallholder farmers are actually classed poor. So even before they started to migrate from rural areas to semi-urban areas, these farmers were already low-earning Nigerians. And now they're now being threatened by their livelihoods because they have to leave. They have to leave because you have a situation where there are bandit groups. There are over 2,000 bandit groups right now in Nigeria. That is a terrible number to look at. And these are bandit groups with membership numbers as low as 24 and membership numbers as high as 4,000. So depending on who their leader is, maybe Abba Gude, or Serikin Daji, many of their names, I've really forgotten the number of their names. These are bandit leaders that govern over 2,000 fighters.
It's really...
So all of that dynamic brings into the picture in the sense that government can curtail this slide into poverty if they ensure security. That's the first thing.
Very important, and not a very pretty picture we're looking at ahead, but hopefully things turn around for the better. But let's talk about what's currently happening around the world and the geopolitical implications for Nigeria. Over 70% of Nigeria's foreign exchange earnings come from the sale of crude oil, and oil plays an important part in our economy and nationhood. As we speak, the United States of America went into Venezuela, kidnapped the president, his wife, and they said, according to Donald Trump, is going to control the oil. And not just control Venezuela's oil, control what they spend the money on, that they have to just buy American goods and use American services and all of that. Now, bringing it back home, what implications would they have for Nigeria that has benchmarked the 2026 budget on $64.85 a barrel. Is that a realistic benchmark? Will crude oil prices go up or down as a result of the events in Venezuela?
Yeah, so again, this is a very technical question that needs a bit of care when answering, but let me stick with the fundamentals first before other probables. Right now, as it speaks, Venezuela, the United States of America controlling the oil industry in Venezuela, does next to nothing in terms of price dynamics for global oil prices. And the reason for that is that Venezuela's supply to the global oil market is negligible, right? Because they have the largest oil reserves doesn't necessarily mean that they have a significant impact in the oil price market for a number of reasons. One, in spite of their 303 billion barrels oil reserves, current oil production in Venezuela is just north of 1 million barrels per day, right? And not a lot of that goes to the oil markets. In fact, a significant number of that actually goes to the illegal oil market, mostly obviously to Russia and China. Outside of that, the numbers that get in as formal exports are between 500,000 barrels per day to 750,000 barrels per day. In fact, as of December 2025, due to the punitive measures of the United States, they were only able to export 500,000 barrels per day. Now, if you wipe out anything or everything that Venezuela already gives to the oil market, you can still, cover that with, I would say, extras from a number of countries. The United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia has over 3 million barrels per day of crude oil in spare. So basically, they are spare supply. So if you wipe out anything that Venezuela currently gives to the global energy market, you can complete that, even increase that just from Saudi Arabia and UAE's spare. Now, moving to what the effect might be on Nigeria. Before even going there, I just also want to give some specifics as to what the current state of infrastructure is in the oil industry in Venezuela. And the major reason why you can't really convert those numbers into an impact in the price levels. At its peak in the 1970s, Venezuela were producing about 2.5 to 3 million barrels of crude oil to the global energy market. That was significant, that was very influential, and that obviously ensured a lot of things for Venezuela economically. Unfortunately, there has been a dereliction in their infrastructure over the last 30 to 40 years for a number of reasons that I'm not going to. And the specifics of their infrastructure is this. Firstly, over 95% of the crude oil in reserves that Venezuela has is what we call heavy crude. Now, to extract that heavy crude, you need a lot of electricity because the system there is significantly different from how you extract crude oil, say, for Nigeria or other parts, right? You need the export infrastructure, for instance, of pipelines that can convey this heavy crude. To convey the heavy crude, you need to reduce the viscosity of the heavy crude. You need steam for that. Steam needs to be generated using electricity. Venezuela has a serious electricity issue. In fact, they currently have an infrastructure deficit for electricity of about 15 to 20,000 megawatts of electricity. So they need to be able to generate that level, and that will come at a huge cost, right? The same thing for the export terminal infrastructure. They only have about 1.5 million barrels capacity. And even at that, peak capacity is at 900,000 barrels. Their main export terminal is the export terminal at the Port Puerto Jose, right? And the Port Puerto Jose needs a total revamp, not the temporary turnaround maintenance that we currently do in Nigeria for our refineries. You need much more than that. Now, outside of that, if I transition from the infrastructure dereliction, which will take at least 4 or 5 years of consistent investment to revamp, you're not going to be able to get the effective number of supply from Venezuela to affect. So it's not really going to do anything to the global market. What might happen, and now this comes to answering the second question about what this impact might have on Nigeria.
Yeah.
What might happen is that if the United States, based on this direct control that Donald Trump wants to exert on the oil industry in Venezuela, if they actually succeed in incentivizing their oil super majors like ExxonMobil, Chevron, ConocoPhillips, and the rest, if they actually succeed, because again, it's also another incentives game that is really tough. How do you attract the CEOs to come into that place where there's a lot of infrastructure deficit, there's a lot of security situation that has to be sorted out? You need to make sure that the incentives are very nice. And if the incentives are nice, if the White House succeeds in getting the right incentives, that basically means that potential foreign direct investment that we need for our oil industry in Nigeria from Texas, from all of those HQs in Texas, from the oil super majors, conveys a way to Venezuela. So that is probably the only impact of the decision of a direct control. And that is dependent on if the incentives are right from White House. If the incentives are right from White House, the potential deep oil offshore FDI that we need from super majors in the next 5-10 years reduce. That obviously affects our core fundamentals in terms of foreign exchange inflow. Outside of that, there's not going to be a lot of, in fact, impact would be negligible or non-existent whatsoever in terms of America's direct control on Venezuela.
Right. Thank you so much, Basil Abia, for breaking it down for us. So it was a pleasure speaking with you, Basil Abia, co-founder of Truva Intelligence. Thank you so much.